from her serving on the city council to serving in Congress and for Hawaii, for her serving in the Army National Guard. That's service, that's selflessness. And that's exactly what we need today. Someone that's willing to stand up and fight for our communities, willing to stand up for those that are the least of those within our communities. And we are so fortunate for the Cedar Valley to have Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard here with us today. So without further ado, can we give her a round of applause?
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming. Aloha. How are you, sir?
Welcome.
Good to see you. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Thanks so much for coming. Thank you. How are you, Tom?
Good.
It's great to see you.
It's good seeing you.
Thank you, Mayor. It's tremendous. Please give a round of applause for Mayor Hart. It's just tremendous to be learning more and more about your community and to hear about the leadership of Mayor Hart and those who he's working with to put service above self, to put the well-being of people at the forefront of all that we do. As you said, Mayor, leadership is really critical during challenging times and times of prosperity. And I appreciate the leadership that you are bringing here to Waterloo. Thank you so much. And I want to recognize one of the very first people that I met when I first came to Iowa, before I had even announced that I was running for president, former city councilman Tom Powers, who continues to lead and serve in many different ways. He's in Washington a lot of the times, been working with him most recently on helping to pass legislation for women who are survivors of breast cancer to get access to the care and prosthetics that they need. So thank you, Tom, for your continued service. And here to our Democratic County Chair, Vicki, thank you so much for all that you continue to do. Mayor Hart was telling me a little bit more about Vicki's many years of service and activism that I didn't realize until today began when you were 11 years old, growing up in Alabama, telling your mom that you were going to the library when you were really going to march for civil rights. Little white lie there. Just so incredible to see where you have come from and how you have taken to heart you know, the life and the example and the words of people who I've grown to admire through my life. Congressman John Lewis constantly says over and over again in front of all different groups of people, it is time that we make good trouble, right? You've been making good trouble for a long time. Thank you so much. And last but not least, I just want to thank Brass Tap owner there in the back. Raise your hand. You got a great crew and staff here. Thanks so much for hosting us all here today. We really, really appreciate it. And thank you all for taking time out of your Sunday afternoon to come and give me the opportunity to share a few words with you and to allow me to hear what is on your mind. I'll start our conversation today with this topic of leadership, because it really is at the forefront of why we are here. The important decision that each of you have before you as you think about who you want to cast your vote for in the upcoming caucuses and in the general election, and why this matters so much. For a while now, and I see this amongst those in my peer group, my age group, I see this in people who are from a generation before us and a generation after us saying, well, why does voting even matter? Why does our participation matter? Because, you know, in Washington, we got a whole bunch of people who are more interested in their own political power or getting rich or gaining influence than they are really about listening to the needs of the people and coming together to find solutions for them. So, you know, elections don't matter, votes matter, because the whole system is broken. And they're not completely wrong. You know, I understand when people say, I've never voted in my whole life, or I've never gotten involved in the process, I haven't voted for years, because they're so disheartened by the status quo. And the status quo in reality is that we have a government that for so long has been a government not of, by, and for the people, but of, by, and for the very few the very rich and the very powerful. Easy words to say. When you think about what this means on a practical level, we begin to see why this matters to us, how it impacts our lives, and therefore why voting and participating in this process to bring about this systemic change is so important. Because leadership matters. What kinds of leaders we, the people, choose to not only lead us, but to serve the people. To serve the people. I appreciate very much the principles of servant leadership. And I remember several years ago when I was talking about the principles of servant leadership, I was surprised that some folks who were much older than I am or very highly educated, they said, servant leadership, what is that? That's an oxymoron. Being a servant is a contradiction to the concept of being a leader. And that made me sad because when you look at the great leaders that we have had in our country, not only in government, but in business and healthcare and science and education, the best leaders are those who are not serving their own selfish interest, but are instead thinking about how can we make a positive impact on those around us. Whether you're talking about a high school teacher, a principal, or the president of a big university, or a hospital, or the President of the United States, or a member of Congress, or a mayor, at every single level, every part of our lives, we can think about servant leadership being, how can I do something for others? How can I have a positive impact on other people's lives? And this is unfortunately what's been lost. And I've been in Congress now for nearly 7 years, and I feel this every time I go back because the conversations that are happening in Washington are so completely different than the conversations we are having in communities like yours. The conversations that, you hear if you go and you just sit down in a coffee shop and just listen to the chatter that's happening around you. It might as well be a different world. And why is that? Because Washington is so, it's really a bubble that revolves around how do we win the next election? How do you curry favor with those who are in power? And then ultimately, how do you serve whatever interest it is that you're representing, whether that be a political interest or a corporate interest or one that's trying to gain influence or in the media. When you look at it, none of those things are about serving the people, which is really what that U.S. Capitol, that White House is supposed to represent. It's supposed to be the people's house. That White House is the White House that should represent the values and interests of the American people. This is what's at the heart of the kind of change that we are seeking to bring about. It's at the heart of the kind of leadership that I hope to bring to the White House, leadership that stems from this heart of putting service above self, putting the well-being of people ahead of politics, people ahead of profits, and really thinking about every policy that we pass, every decision that's made, being a decision that puts the well-being of the people and the planet above all else. Now, as we go through, and we'll talk a lot today about many of the different issues that we're concerned about, we can see how the kind of change we want to make is possible. And we'll start with healthcare, because I know this is an important issue. How many of you are concerned about healthcare here today? I'd say most of you. It's something that affects all of us, no matter your age, your background, or your unique story or anything else. One of the most egregious examples of a government of, by, and for the rich and powerful is the fact that the United States government and Medicare is not allowed to negotiate lower prescription drug prices with big pharmaceutical companies. Not allowed. It's actually written in the law, prohibited. And so what's the impact of this? Well, our government is the largest customer of prescription drugs in the world. Let you guys get situated. Thank you so much for coming here today. You're fine. Don't worry about it. I'm going to say that one more time because it shocked me when I read it. The United States government is the largest purchaser of prescription drugs in the world. In the world. So when you think about that, what does that mean? That means we, the people, have a lot of purchasing power. That means we have a lot of leverage to be able to negotiate with big pharmaceutical companies to drive those prices lower through negotiations. This is why prescription drug companies, year after year after year, every time we bring legislation forward to change this law that currently prohibits the US government from negotiating lower prices, they fight it tooth and nail. And so far they have succeeded. They have succeeded in keeping the language in our laws that hurts people who need medicine and benefits their profits. How is that possible? Because they've got a whole bunch of high-powered lobbyists in Washington who curry favor with and write PAC checks to members of Congress and buy their seat at the table when those decisions are being made. I read somewhere that prescription drug companies spend more on lobbyists and PACs in Washington than they do on those television ads that we see every single night. And we see a lot of those ads, right? During primetime television. They spend more on PACs and lobbyists in Washington than they do on those television ads. This tells you something. Why? It's because this system is corrupt. At its heart, it is a corrupt system that has allowed this to take place. This is one example of many of why this systemic change is so necessary, to make sure that we, the people, can overcome the obstacle of big money and special interests in our politics and in Washington, and make sure with healthcare that we have a true healthcare for all system. That we're making sure every single American is able to get the healthcare that they need when they need it, regardless if they have a little money in their pocket or a lot. As the wealthiest nation in the world, there is no excuse that we spend far more on healthcare now than anyone else, and yet we still have worse outcomes. This is because our healthcare system is really not a healthcare system. It's one that allows this crony capitalism to take place where big pharma and big insurance walk away with big profits, while families, our senior citizens, small business owners struggle just to be able to make sure that you have that basic care. We look at some of the other issues and the challenges that we're facing. We look at immigration reform. How do we bring about the kinds of immigration reform that we need to see? Put people ahead of politics. There's no question that we need comprehensive immigration reform. This is something that both Republicans and Democrats really do agree on. May have different ideas on how to get there or where you spend this amount of money and how you change our laws within our legal immigration system, but the concern is across the board. And I've heard from small business owners, from farmers, and people here in Iowa who say proudly, I'm a Republican. I've always been a Republican. I always will be. We need comprehensive immigration reform because there's a lot of people who are doing the jobs for my business that if they went away, I wouldn't be able to stay in business. There's so much that can be done and that we will do in order to fix our broken legal immigration system, to send the resources necessary to the border, judges and administrators there to address those who are seeking asylum in our country, to secure our borders, and to change our laws to make it so that those who are seeking asylum in our country can do so in their country of origin. Actually, look at what is the root cause of these problems and bring about solutions to solve them. Not allowing these partisan political battles to get in the way. Criminal justice reform is another issue that we're focusing a lot on in Washington, but you don't really realize what impact it has unless you're a part of it. We were doing a town hall a few weeks ago here in Iowa, and the county supervisor came and talked to me about his number one issue, which was criminal justice reform, which frankly surprised me because usually a county supervisor will talk about, hey, we need dollars for infrastructure. We need more funding from the federal government to support our firefighters and our law enforcement officers. We need new sewer systems. These are the kinds of things that I normally hear about. But he came and he said, criminal justice. I said, wow, that's interesting. Tell me more. how much money is spent in the whole circle of criminal justice, from law enforcement to not having enough resources for judges, to having overcrowded prisons, and then to having a lack of resources to bring down the high recidivism rates that we're seeing with people cycling through our prison systems over and over and over again. Those are dollars that are coming out of that county budget. His priority was criminal justice reform, ending the federal marijuana prohibition, ending private prisons, ending this cash bail system, looking at all of these different contributors that are making our broken system and our unjust system one that is not serving those who are going through it, and it is taking resources away from the needs that we have in our communities here at home. There's a number of other issues. I want to talk about the environment. I want to talk about climate change. This is something that unfortunately has become such a divisive issue with those who say, well, you're either a climate believer, you're a climate denier, which is such an unfortunate thing because it is very important. Our environment is very important. It's one that shouldn't divide us as people, because when it comes right down to it, again, put the politics aside and just focus on what's real. Every single one of us here needs clean water to drink and survive. We can't survive without it. Clean air to breathe. We want to be able to have a safe space to live. For us, for our kids, for their kids, for their kids. We want to be able to have farmers, our family farmers, be able to continue to grow food, crops for our people. When we look at the many different environmental threats that we face, they come from a lot of different directions, and they require us coming together in order to be able to address those threats, in order to be able to protect our environment for the safety and well-being of our people for a long time to come. There's a few things I think we need to do in order to address this. First, come together to recognize this is a problem we can solve together, transition off of fossil fuels, and the nearly $30 billion that are coming out of our pockets as taxpayers, going to fund and subsidize big fossil fuel corporations, and instead say, hey, how can those resources better be spent to invest in clean renewable energy and infrastructure? I know Iowa here, y'all are making a lot more progress towards investing in wind than many other states, and a lot of those wind turbines are being built right here in Iowa, which is tremendous. But it's showing here how making this transition is not only good for the environment, but it's actually good for our pocketbooks. We're creating high-paying jobs here in the United States of America and creating energy that is being delivered at a lower cost than fossil fuel. We look at the kinds of investments that we make in sustainable infrastructure, the kinds of changes we need to bring about in old, outdated agriculture practices of these multinational agribusiness corporations that are so harmful to the environment, and instead look at the amazing technology and innovations that we're seeing in agriculture through regenerative agriculture and others that allows us to be able to continue to farm, protects our soil quality, and has a positive impact on our environment. These are some of the changes that we need to make, recognizing that we need to do this for our communities and our people here at home. But in order to address the global challenge that we're seeing, the global threats that exist, we must be able to work with other countries. Because even if we do everything that we must right here, right now, it still won't even come close to where we need to be on this planet, with all the other partners and people that we share this planet with. So these are big changes that we need to make. They are big changes that we need to make, and we can't afford to continue to keep kicking the ball down the road. They require us as people. Yes, exercising leadership that puts service above self, that puts people ahead of profits. It requires us coming together and making sure that our voices are heard over the big moneyed interests that have been ruling for too long, for their benefit to the detriment of the people. Now, there's an issue that is central to our ability to make these kinds of investments, to dedicate these resources where they're needed, to serve the needs of our people. That issue is the cost of war. You're not going to hear very many people talk about this, which is an unfortunate thing. As a veteran, and I'm still serving as a soldier, I know firsthand the terribly high human cost of war. And seeing every day, I was deployed to Iraq in 2005 in a field medical unit, and every single day being confronted with that high human cost of war. With American lives lost, my brothers and sisters in uniform, lives lost for the people in Iraq, people in the countries where we've waged these terribly wasteful, counterproductive wars, the cost and the toll that it takes on our veterans when they come home. But whether you realize it or not, there's a cost that's being paid by every single one of you, every single American, with over $6 trillion, over $6 trillion coming out of our pockets, going to pay for these wasteful wars of choice that have undermined our national security, that have taken such a toll on our men and women in uniform, that have caused such pain and destruction in the countries where we've waged these wars, countries like Iraq and Libya and Syria, a war that's continuing to this day. And has taken a toll on our communities, because every single dollar that goes towards paying to go and overthrow a authoritarian dictator in one country or another, and then to pay for the nation building that follows, is a dollar that's coming out of our schools, a dollar that's coming out of our healthcare system, coming out of our ability to make sure our roads and bridges are safe, that our levees are safe. It's a dollar coming out of our ability to serve the needs of our people here at home. So if you hear anybody say, yeah, okay, well, you know, Tulsi talks a lot about foreign policy, I can't figure out why. This is why. This is why. Because you hear a lot about what politicians want to do for you and this new program and that new program. Well, we have to talk about how we pay for things. And we cannot address those needs of our family, friends, children, the people in our communities that we care about, unless we address where our money is going and get our priorities straight. As your president and commander-in-chief, I will lead with a foreign policy that is focused on cooperation rather than conflict. Ending this long-held policy of the United States being the policeman of the world, ending these wasteful, counterproductive regime change wars, working to end this new Cold War that we are in, ever-escalating tensions between the United States and nuclear-armed countries like Russia and China, and this arms race that's continuing to escalate, costing us more money, making us and the world less safe, and redirect those resources and those dollars either going back into our pockets or going into serving the people in our communities. This is the sea change in our foreign policy and our leadership and our priorities that I seek to bring about, and I'm asking for your support to stand with me and help us get there. Thank you so much. Thank you. I love to open it up to questions, comments. Yes, ma'am, we'll start with you. There's a microphone for you.
Hi, I'm Christine Carpenter, and I'm a member of the Cedar Valley Cancer Committee's Beyond Pink team. We're a member organization of the National Breast Cancer Coalition.
Awesome.
And I want to thank you very much for signing the National Breast Cancer Coalition's public policy platform,
Yes.
which is guaranteed access to quality health care for all, research that is sufficient funds that are transparent and accountable to the public, and also making sure that trained advocates are at all decision-making tables. So thank you very much for signing that policy platform.
Thank you. Thank you for your advocacy and helping to make sure that we are working together to accomplish those goals and objectives. Thank you very much. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
For years, we had a local group called Iowans for a Free Palestine, and I'm not an authority, but my perspective on the Middle East has been changed from books we read and DVDs we watched. And I'm concerned our current president has linked arms with Saudi Arabia in some agenda to get rid of or weaken Iran, and it's costing us, and we're sending military weapons and troops now, and if any of those come under harm's way, I'm afraid it's going to drag us into a conflict. We deserve better.
Your fear, sir, is unfortunately well-founded. I share these same concerns. And this speaks to the reality that the president's most important responsibility is to serve as commander-in-chief, and why that matters. I want to touch on a couple of these points, and I'm glad that you raised this, because this is something that we are currently facing here, where this president and his administration has pushed us to the brink of a war with Iran that could start with just one spark. A war that would be far more devastating, far more costly and destructive than anything we saw in the Iraq War. It's almost unimaginable to think about, because this war that we waged to overthrow Saddam Hussein and everything that followed after was terribly costly. We are still paying the price, and we will for a long time to come. And when you think about the scale of the reality that this war with Iran would make the Iraq War look like a picnic, is unimaginable. You're talking about a country that is much bigger than Iraq. They have a much larger and stronger military, if you're talking about conventional warfare. They have unconventional warfare tactics and personnel that they have spent a lot of time and money training. It's a war that would not be contained within the country of Iran. It would spread across the region. It would cost us countless American lives, even more, trillions dollars, and it would wreak such havoc across the region, making an even greater refugee crisis than anything we've ever seen before. And why? Why are we in this?
It's a war they don't want.
It's a war that Iran doesn't want. It's a war this president claims he doesn't want, but every decision that he's made has said the exact opposite. And we've got to look at his actions to see how we got here. He tore up the Iran nuclear agreement, an agreement that Iran was complying with. He then escalated crippling sanctions, even though Iran was still in compliance with that agreement. He then went and declared Iran's military as a terrorist organization, just like ISIS, something that has never been done by any country to any other country in history. And then he went and sent more American troops to Saudi Arabia and other countries around Iran, further escalating this tension, and just announcing a few days ago that he would send even more. Why? How does this serve the interests of the American people in the United States? It does not. It does not. It serves the interests of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is saying, hey, well, we need your military to come and launch this attack for us. We need you to come and protect us. And that's exactly what our troops are being used there for. Which I tell you, as a soldier, this goes against the very reason why we sign up to serve, why we take that oath of enlistment, to support and defend our Constitution, the American people, to protect our people. What Donald Trump is doing here is dishonors every single service member who has served or who will be serving, and proves yet again how he is unfit to be our commander-in-chief. Thank you.
So Tulsi, how do we get the money out of politics that doesn't belong there? The illegal things that are being done with money in politics, and the lies on advertising off the media, off television. Absolute lies that they allow and take money to put on.
Yeah.
And get the news organization to start covering the news. We don't have the news covered very well in this area.
Yeah. Thank you. You cover a lot of things. I want to try to address each of them relatively briefly. Look, getting this big special interest in this legal corruption out of our political system is essential. I think there's a number of ways that we need to do that. Members of Congress should not be accepting PAC money, period. When you look at the accountability there, that accountability, there needs to be no doubt in any of your minds about who your representative is working for. They need to be working for you. We need to close the revolving door that we see in Washington, where you have folks who are working in government who then go and get a payout and work in the industry that they were just supposed to be exercising oversight for. Closing that revolving door and making sure if you choose a path of public service within our government, then you're choosing a path of public service, and you shouldn't be doing so expecting that you'll get a big payout at the end of it when you go and work for that industry, or you're able to go and work for the company that you helped write a contract for. There's so many different layers of this in many different industries in our government, from Wall Street to healthcare to defense, education, pharmaceutical companies, and so forth. The coverage in our news, and there's one thing, you mentioned we need to know who is paying for these ads. We need to know whose money is coming in and funding those who are influencing voters. A lot of people don't realize that, in Washington you have all these different think tanks, and there's a lot that have to do with foreign policy. And they come in and they testify before committees in Congress as foreign policy experts coming from think tank X, Y, or Z. But what they're not telling you as they sit there in front of the Foreign Affairs Committee, they have their name placard there and where they're from, they're not telling you is, well, this is a think tank that takes millions of dollars from Saudi Arabia, or a think tank that takes millions of dollars from Turkey, or the UAE, or China, or Russia, or any other country. And that lack of transparency to the American people does a disservice and undermines the message that they're delivering, undermines our ability to make our own decisions about what kinds of information we're taking in. With the news, there used to be a law that was in place called the Fairness Doctrine that made it so that our public airwaves, they are still our public airwaves, are actually presenting unbiased news and information to us as voters, as the audience. This law was repealed, I think almost 2 decades ago. I've just introduced legislation to reinstate the Fairness Doctrine, which simply says, on our public airwaves, we deserve the right to be able to hear the unbiased news. And if there's a view that's presented on one side of an issue, you have to present the other side as well. So we can make our decisions about where we fall, where we stand, what our opinion is on these things. Thank you.
Like you, I am a veteran, so I'd like to thank you for
you.
your service. Coming home from the military, something that's always been very important to me is my safety and the safety of my son and my family. And something that's this question's is about gun control. Yeah. And Neil deGrasse Tyson once said that we as a society react to spectacle, not to facts. And the fact of the matter is, when it comes to guns, there's far more defensive use of firearms than there are mass shootings and things of that sort. Unfortunately, people on your side of this issue, the D in front of your name, are very much oblivious to that fact. And I don't know if they're just refusing to see the facts, or if I don't know. So I guess my question is, as president, what are you going to do to protect my right to defend my son when these mass shootings happen and people are coming after my ability to do that? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you again for your service. This is an issue that is coming up more and more to the forefront as, unfortunately, more of these tragedies and mass shootings occur. And it is heartbreaking to see how such an important question about safety and security and our lives, the lives of our loved ones, has for so long become just a divisive political issue, where there's very little real conversation happening, getting to the heart of the question that you're bringing up: keeping our loved ones safe, defending ourselves. If we have these conversations, I am fully confident that we would be able to make sure that we are upholding people's Second Amendment rights while also ensuring that those few who would seek to do harm to others with these guns are not able to have them. That, to me, is what this really comes down to. And unfortunately, we haven't seen legislation passed. We haven't seen some of these current laws enforced because it is a political divisive issue where there's fear being fomented on both sides. Or on one side, you'll hear folks saying, if you pass any legislation whatsoever related to gun safety, then it's a slippery slope that will lead to the government banging down your door and taking away your guns. That's the argument you hear on one side. On the other side, you have the other view saying, well, the government should come in and bang down your door and take all your guns. But what happens in between of those extremes is where I believe most Americans are, in respecting our Constitution, upholding our Second Amendment, while making sure that those few who would seek to do harm to others are not able to get their hands on those guns. If we focus our conversation and come together, putting the politics aside, then we can pass the kinds of sensible gun safety legislation that I think we need to see. Things like universal background checks that actually work, again, to make sure that those few are not the ones who are able to get their hands on guns, while respecting the rights of the vast majority of people who are law-abiding gun owners in this country. There are deeper issues when we look at these tragedies that are occurring that have to be addressed. I do believe that we need to pass legislation, but I know that we are also all not so naive as to think passing a law alone will solve this problem. There are shootings that happen in cities every single day in this country, taking the lives of young kids who are walking to school, families at home, innocent bystanders, people whose names never make the headlines. Their stories are never heard, but their families are grieving just the same. We as a country just need to come together, get past the partisan politics, and really get to the heart of what is happening here and how we can best help and address and serve those needs to prevent this kind of violence that we're seeing. There's not one single answer to this. It takes a deep goal of introspection and coming together for us to see how we can make sure that our communities are safe, so that our loved ones and us, that we're not having to live in fear that those we love might be taken from us in an instant. Thank you.
We'll go in the back there.
You have a voice for radio, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Anyway, so first, thank you for just being the strong anti-war voice in the national conversation. I don't think it can be overstated how important that is. So thank you first for doing that.
Thank you.
But specifically, I noticed when you were talking about foreign policy, you specifically did not mention Afghanistan. I don't know if that was just a slip of the tongue or something, but it is the longest war that we've had post 9/11. It's probably, I don't know the numbers, but just due to its length, it's probably had the most money dumped into it.
Yeah.
So going off of that, I just kind of want to hear your plan to really follow through on these fantastic goals of ending wars. They've tried
Yep.
over and over again through multiple presidencies to end it, has been ended. I want you to talk about how you're going to follow through on ending wars.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you. The wars that I mentioned, Iraq, Libya, and Syria, were mentioned very specifically within the context of regime change wars. What we've seen in Afghanistan has been a slightly different one. Our country did not go into Afghanistan with the aim of toppling an authoritarian dictator as we have in these other countries. Instead, what we saw is an initial mission that was centered around defeating Al-Qaeda. I think our troops did a very effective and efficient job in doing that. The problem was that the focus, instead of remaining one-pointedly focused on that mission, our leaders failed us by beginning to wage a whole series of regime change wars in other countries in the world. And in Afghanistan, that single-pointed mission turned into something that was very ambiguous and broad, which has resulted in our continuing to be there, thousands of our troops continuing to be occupied there, and $4 billion of our taxpayer dollars every month going to Afghanistan. $4 billion every single month. Think about how we could use those dollars in our communities here. You know, what kinds of investments, what kind of changes, what kinds of fixes that we could bring about. I saw some numbers recently pointing to Afghanistan and about how they are dependent on American taxpayer dollars for almost 70% of their GDP. And there's a lot of corruption in their government. There's a lot of issues and complexities that ultimately need to be worked out by the Afghan people. They need to be able to bring about those reforms in their own government. It's not something that we can or should be able to do for them. So actionable plan, how do we do this? We bring our troops home from Afghanistan. That should have happened a long time ago, not contingent on anything else. We bring our troops home from Afghanistan immediately. The mission and the concern about Al-Qaeda, when every time you talk about this, say, well, what about Al-Qaeda? We've got to make sure that they don't set up a headquarters and a stronghold in Afghanistan again. If you use that logic, we would have troops occupying every country in the world. The attack on our country on 9/11 was planned in a hotel room in the Philippines. That is not an excuse for us to continue to send our men and women downrange into harm's way in order to accomplish some obscure objective of what? We need to make sure that we continue to stay focused on defeating this threat of Al-Qaeda, both militarily and ideologically. Occupying a country is not required to accomplish that. Ensuring our national security, we can keep an eye on what's going on in Afghanistan, work with the Afghan government, work with surrounding countries, and say, hey, look, if there is the beginnings of a new Al-Qaeda cell that's forming in there, let's go in, send in some special forces teams, eliminate that threat, and get out. Being smarter about how we are serving and strengthening our national security without unnecessarily wasting lives and money. This comes down to leadership. When you look at all these wars that we're talking about, Congress did not pass any declaration of war for any of them. They were started and waged in the executive branch. So this is why I'm running for president. This is why serving that role as commander-in-chief is so important, to be able to make those decisions, to bring our troops home, to recalibrate our foreign policy. To recalibrate our foreign policy so that it's one that's actually A, serving the interests of our country and the American people, and B, being a force for good and a positive influence in the world. If you just look at this shift in policy of stop trying to be the world's police and instead working with other countries in a cooperative way rather than running around with the bully pulpit of the strongest military in the world, think about how much more we could accomplish. Seeing war truly as the last resort to keep the American people safe, rather than one as we're seeing this president use with Iran right now. So these are the kinds of changes that I would bring about, and I would bring them about through the strong leadership in the Oval Office, bringing the experience that I bring both as a soldier as well as serving in Congress for almost 7 years, focused on the Foreign Affairs Committee, Armed Services Committee, Homeland Security Committee, not bowing to the interests of the military-industrial complex or the foreign policy establishment in Washington. This is, I think, what sets me apart from both others who are running for president now, as well as if you look at leaders in the past who have maybe run for office, and you've heard some of these same things from them, perhaps, about how they want to end stupid wars, about they want to bring our troops home, but they have lacked the experience and the conviction to stand up to the powerful foreign policy establishment in Washington and end up falling influence to them every time. This is what I will change.
We got time for one more question.
Hey, Congressman, I'm Victor. I came from Iowa City.
Thank you for coming, Victor.
What are your priorities for your first day in office as the 46th United States President?
I'm going to get you at the same time and answer both of your questions together.
You may regret this one.
Okay. Give me my mic back.
The role is the law of the land, okay? how do you feel about the law that was passed in New York, basically to decriminalize abortion all the way up until time of birth? I think you have a little different view than the rest of your compadres.
Thank you. Look, first day in office, I will begin to set in motion the change in foreign policy that we're talking about immediately. This isn't something that waits until year 3 of my first term. This is something that begins immediately. One of the things, and I talked briefly about this earlier, was working to end this new Cold War and these escalating tensions that we're seeing between our country and nuclear-armed countries like Russia and China. I begin to de-escalate those tensions by immediately calling for a summit with these other countries, talking about where are the areas of difference and problems that we need to negotiate and work through, and where are the areas of shared and common interest that we can work together on. You don't hear a lot about this new Cold War, but if you look at what's actually happening, just a few weeks ago, President Trump, I don't know if it was through a tweet or something else, but he said, China is our enemy. Those are not light words to be thrown about. And for those of us who are soldiers and veterans here in the room, you say somebody is our enemy, that means something. That means there is a follow-through that must occur then. So we can't take this lightly. And now Trump is waging a trade and tariff war with China, an economic war with a nuclear-armed country that could turn from an economic war into a hot war. And then you're in a completely different situation where we, the American people, are facing a nuclear threat. You look at the reality that where we stand today, the United States and Russia still have nuclear-armed missiles, thousands of them pointed at each other on hair-trigger alert. And for those in the room who were around for the previous Cold War, you know how serious this is. We got a huge wake-up call in Hawaii last year on the reality that a nuclear attack or catastrophe could occur at any moment, not just for us in Hawaii dealing with North Korea, but for anyone in this country. What does that mean at a practical level is what we saw. We got that message on our cell phones early on a Saturday morning saying, missile incoming, seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. And in that moment, no, it's no joke. You got 15 minutes to seek immediate shelter. Where are you going to go? Exactly. That is the point. Where are you going to go? Where is their shelter? Where will you find protection? And what we found is there is no shelter. That's the big hoax, is our leaders have failed us. They have pushed us to this point where we are facing a greater threat of nuclear catastrophe now than ever before. But guess what? There is no shelter. There is no shelter. And what we went through in Hawaii was a major event that, for me personally, made that decision for me to run for president, to be able to bring about this change in our leadership, because it doesn't have to be this way. This is not the new norm that we have to accept. We must walk back from the brink of nuclear war to de-escalate these tensions and begin to make progress working towards a world where none of our kids, none of our families, no one on this planet will have to live in fear of nuclear annihilation. Unless we make this change, that is the future. That is the present and the future that we face. There's a number of other things. I could go down the list of the things that I would begin to address. Re-entering the Paris Climate Accords, dealing with undoing a lot of the damaging environmental provisions that Trump has put in place. There's a lot that we need to do, and I think that I'll be very busy. What's that?
You'll need a long first day.
Yeah, long first day. I don't get much sleep. To your question, sir, on abortion. This is often one of the most difficult decisions that a woman will ever have to make. This is not a decision that I would make for myself, but I feel strongly that our government should not be imposing its will on a woman who is making that decision for herself and for her family. So I support Roe v. Wade, and I think that it should continue to be upheld. I do, however, think that in the third trimester, if you look at Roe v. Wade and go back and read through it, that there are restrictions that should be in place during that third trimester.
So you think New York went too far?
Yes. The restrictions in the third trimester will reserve abortion for a woman who's facing severe health consequences or her life is at risk unless she has that option of abortion before her.
Thank you.
Thank you all. I wish we had more time for more questions. Again, I want to thank you all for being here. We'll have a few minutes to be able to, if you want to come and say hello or take a picture, I'd love to meet you in person. I want to hand it off to Amory, who's going to share a few words. Before I do that, I want to say thanks to all of our volunteers who are here. Can you stand up and raise your hands? All of our volunteers. Thank you very much. You guys are the ones who make this happen. And I want to say a special thanks to our friend Steve, who is the best audio guy in all of Iowa. And Steve got together with his friend Jose, was it yesterday morning? And they put together this beautiful flag that Steve carries around in his truck to all of our events. So thank you so much, Steve. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you all for being here again. The Congresswoman is going to stick around if you'd like some pictures. Just some operational logistics on that. This is a very tight room. So we are going to line up behind Janet, who is right here. Just try to keep it single file. If you like what you heard today, find one of our volunteers that raised their hand just a minute ago. Come help us out, join our campaign, put up a lawn sign, knock on doors, make some phone calls, whatever it takes and whatever you can do, we will take it and we'll, one by one, we'll make a change to Iowa and the rest of this country. Thank you.
Go. Thank you. So nice to see you again.
Thank you so much.
Great job.
Thank you for everything you're doing. I really
There's
appreciate
no
it.
combination of words I could put on the back of a postcard. No song that I could sing, but I can try for your heart. Our dreams,
Give
and
us some
they're made out
pointers
of
on
real things.
organizing here.
Shoebox of
Exactly.
photographs with sepia tone loving. Love is the answer, at least for most of the questions.